in theology and philosophy at Notre Dame. He's previously worked with the Catholic chaplaincy at NSW and is currently completing his Masters in philosophy. This looks to be a good subject to hear a talk on, so let's give him a welcome, everyone.
Thanks, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, when I was looking around at the different things, I noticed some slightly different worded questions about today's talk. But hopefully the way we approach it, you can piece together the answer to all of those. Now, there's no doubt that when you first saw this topic, more than a few points or questions rushed to your mind. The truth is, it's a huge topic and we can't hope to cover all the aspects of it in the next 40 minutes or so. So I think it's important for us to be able to hone in on a particular area in order to arrive at the truth of that area to move forward. So that means that particularly in this session, what I'll be concentrating on is the metaphysical question of what is a fetus? What is it? When you point to it and you say, what's that? What's the answer that makes most sense? From there we can derive moral conclusions in terms of how you treat it. One of the biggest mistakes we can always make is to work out what we want to do with something before we know what it is. If someone came up to you and said, I need some advice on how to look after my pet, and you didn't know what it was or how old it was, it's very hard to give concrete answers. More than likely you'll just get into an argument with the person and walk away thinking, what's wrong with them? So we have to get as much facts together as we can about the situation at hand. I want to start with a story. Noah Benton Markham was a survivor of Hurricane Katrina in 2006. Where he was trapped in the hospital, police officers courageously stormed in there and saved him. Now, this is a unique story because his rescue only finished 16 months after he was pulled out of that room. The unique situation was the police officers pulled out a canister of frozen embryos. One of the police officers put their life on the line to carry out a canister with 1,400 human embryos, one of them being Noah. And so when Noah was born 16 months later, there was a direct link between the heroic act that that police officer did that day and this baby in the hands of his new parents. Now, if that day in the hurricane, that police officer didn't save a person, then what he did say would be a very difficult question to answer. I think Noah would have some ideas, but let's see if we can reason about it now to see how we can arrive at that conclusion. I've got to warn you that one of the things I've realized in philosophy is that it's the so-called common sense things which really become quite difficult when you try and analyze it. For example, how do you know you're not a brain in a bat, things like that. When we start getting questions like that, it becomes amazingly complex because we start questioning the very foundations of how we understand what reality is. This is one of the questions that since philosophy began, as long as we've had people asking questions, this has been a real fundamental question. What is it? What's the reality of this thing in front of me? This we traditionally call one aspect of metaphysics, which is ontology, which is the study of being, the study of reality, the study of what is that. So it's separate to the question, how do I know what it is? Because when I ask the question, how do I know what it is, notice how it presupposes knowing what it is. So when we're asking the question, what is a fetus? This is the realm of philosophy that we're talking about. Now, traditionally, these are the definitions of a human being and a person. A human being is a rational animal. A person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Sorry, an individual rational substance. That's a big typo. So, an individual rational substance. Now, the logical conclusion from that is all human beings are persons, not all persons are human beings. Now, you might wonder why they're saying not all persons are human beings. This is because the philosophers at the time were obviously making room for intelligences which were not human. In other words, angels, the persons of the Trinity, etc. Now, a recurring temptation which pops up frequently in philosophy, and unfortunately the last time it really popped up big, we haven't been able to shake it. It's a philosophy called dualism. And that hit really big a few centuries ago with a philosopher called Descartes. Now, dualism says there's two completely different kinds of substances in reality. They're completely and utterly different. One of them is matter, which is visible, measurable, occupies space. And the other one is this invisible spiritual intelligence stuff. Okay? And so you've got two different, fundamentally different substances. Now, if we look back at our definition of what a human being is, suddenly I can use the same definition, but I have a very different understanding of it. A human being is a rational animal. Now, when a dualist sees this, what they see is a human being is a sandwich or a mix or a combination of this visible stuff and this invisible rational stuff. Kind of like when you get two pieces of a sandwich and jam it together. That ultimately they remain separable, but I've put them together. Now, we carry around these ideas all the time. Something like the soul is trapped in our body. You know, your soul is trying to be freed from your body, like the ghost in the machine. Or people imagining that the soul is something that's added to the physical human being sometime later. But either way, they distinguish between the reality of the physical and this intellectual stuff. Now, straight away you can see that a dualist will say that it's not a human being until they have both things. Until I see material matter and until I see reason, I'm not going to say that's a human being. Now, this throws us right into the contemporary debate, because what you'll find is a lot of people will accept that definition of human being, but they'll say, well, until I see it using reason, it's not a human being. Okay, so they're coming at it from this dualist approach. Suddenly it becomes a question, when does this physical thing that I can see become reasonable? You know, and that's where we get the question, when does a fetus become a person? Because remember now, a person is this intellectual, rational thing. But this fetus isn't intellectual, so what are you talking about? I have to wait and see it exercise reason, which is something else, before I call it a human being. So people will start posing solutions. You know, they'll say, well, at the first sign of the development of a brain, which makes rational activity possible for the human being, then we'll say it's a person. But some people say, no. You have to wait for a fully developed brain and nervous system, then we'll say it's a person. Others say, no. It's going to depend on pleasure and pain. Once it can feel pleasure and pain, and voluntarily move away from pain, we'll call it a person. But then some people say, no, well, hang on a second. Let's even look at a newborn baby. How rational is a newborn baby? You know, what equations are they pumping out? How conscious are they of what it is they feel like? And so really, once we've created this dualism, I think ultimately we come to a situation where it becomes arbitrary about when we call it a person. There can be no agreement. You won't find any concrete objective agreement amongst experts on when it is we can say it's a person. Now, once you ever find yourself in that situation, regardless of what field you're in, a little alarm bell should go off. Okay? If you've got people who are supposedly experts in their field but can't agree on something very fundamental, there's a good chance that they're all assuming something which has led them to a situation where it's basically an intellectual dead end. What I'm going to propose in this talk is something which will undermine entirely this question, when does a fetus become a person? It's going to propose a unified understanding of what a human being is, so that it's not two different things meshed together and we've got to find out when's the second thing come along. But in fact that by its nature a human being is always those two things. Now, a human being is a rational animal. This is what we call the essentia. So you might have just learned a new word. This is what we call the essentia of humanity. In other words, it's the kind of thing a human is. When I say to you human, and the idea that pops up in your mind, what comes to mind in your head is the essentia of humanity. It's just an idea. Think about this. For all we know, if human beings are completely annihilated in 100 years, there's a huge nuclear war, and an alien race are there studying human beings, they could agree with that definition, even though no human beings actually exist. The idea still makes sense. We have the essentia of a unicorn, say a horse with a horn sticking out of its head. But that doesn't mean that unicorns exist in the world. It means that I understand the idea of the unicorn. I recognise its characteristics in my mind, so that if I ever see an individual thing, I can say, hey, that's a unicorn. How do I know? Well, because it matches up with the idea, with the essentia that I have in my mind. Now, to break it down, and so we use a less kind of emotionally loaded example, let's look at an apple tree. So say I said the essentia of an apple tree. What an apple tree is, if you look up its definition, would look like something like a plant that produces apples. Now, I'm not talking about a particular apple tree somewhere. I'm talking about anything that is an apple tree falls into this category. The reason it's good to use other examples when you get involved in these discussions is because whenever we're asking questions about how we recognise or identify things, the answer we pose for this particular problem, say apple trees or fetuses, that's the answer for everything. I can't have one rule of identifying what something is for this situation because that's a tough one. And then for the rest of my existence, I use a different metaphysics, so to speak. So it's simply an idea. For all we know, apple trees might not exist in the world, but that would not change the fact that we know what an apple tree is. Okay, we know it's essential. Just to get a quick indication now, nod your head if you're on track with me and shake it if you're thinking this guy has had too much coffee or not enough coffee. Everyone's generally on board? Okay, that's good. Now, this doesn't exactly solve our problem here. Because notice the dualist can still say to me, Christian, I agree that you're talking about the essence of a human being, but you yourself said the essence is rational. So you actually haven't solved the problem. Right? You've simply reworded it. I still want to see when does it manifest reason. Until then, we can agree, but we're still coming to that dead end, but it only seems that way now. So up to this point, we've been talking about essentia, or the idea of a kind of thing. We've been making general universal statements. Let's come back to our example of the apple tree. Do I still call this plant an apple tree if it's too young to ever have produced apples yet? In the off-season, do I still call it an apple tree if it's not producing apples? When it gets too old, do I say that's an old apple tree, or do I say, no, that's just a really good old tree? That's the kind that is old tree. It's really good being an old tree. Or do I say, that's an old apple tree? That's a dead apple tree. Notice how there's a continuation of identity that happens through this life of an apple tree. Now, the problem, if we look at our human problem of rational animal, it's like saying to a person who works with plants, what's their name? What's the name of somebody who specialises in plants? Botanist. It's like saying to a botanist, no, listen, Mr. Botanist, or whatever you call yourself, I'm not going to call this an apple tree until I see an apple on that tree. Now, he's going to actually have to say, hang on a second, Christian, I don't think you quite understand the way nature works. So I decided I'm going to go and plant an apple tree to fix this guy up, to really rock his world. So I go, and I want to go and buy an apple tree and plant it in my backyard. And so I rock up and I say to the person at the counter at Flower Power, or wherever you go to do this, I say, I want an apple tree to plant in my backyard. And they say, sure, here you go. They give me a bag of bloody seeds. I said, no, I don't think you heard what I said. I want an apple tree. And they said, get this, here you go. And I thought, these people, they don't get it. So they said, okay, I think I know what you're looking for, Christian. They take me out the back where they've already got some sprouted plants because they realise that I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. And so they point to this thing here, and it's in a little pot. They say, here's your apple tree, that's $10. And I said, can you see an apple on that thing? Now, this is very interesting because notice how I'm holding them to account what a dualist holds the fetus to account. Right? I want to see an apple on this thing, and until I see that, I won't call it an apple tree. But that goes against our whole understanding of what nature is. Of the idea of something growing, the idea of something changing, the idea of development. If I was to simply want to see this and say, I'm going to plant that in my backyard, and then I'll call it an apple tree, then we can see that you get into all kinds of funny and ironic situations. So how do we work around this? Okay, because it seems that my everyday experience tells me that all of this here is an apple tree. So in a sense, this is what I mentioned at the start. Common sense tells us something, and suddenly when philosophy tries to work it out, it's like, I can see that's an apple tree, but geez, it sounds like they've got a point. Where's the apple? Okay. Now, this is where the genius of St. Thomas kicks in. And it's actually an idea that is first found in Islamic philosophy in the Middle Ages, which made its way across into the Western world with the rediscovery of Aristotle. And it makes an extra distinction with essentia. Okay? Now what that distinction is something called esse. Now esse is an individual act of being. It's a real concrete, particular thing. It's not just the idea of it. So we might say that, if we look at our example of unicorns, right, we'll say that the essentia, the idea of a unicorn exists in our minds. But there's no esse of unicorn in the world. There's no existence added to that idea in the world around us. Okay? Think about that, because this is going to be a very crucial point which really would change the face of all aspects of philosophy for the next 1,000 years after that. And we constantly see people falling into huge, supposedly logical problems because they ignore this difference. Now,